This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one country making a bad decision. What you're watching unfold is quieter than that and far more dangerous. Because this is about a system that no longer tolerates hesitation. A system that has stopped allowing countries to stand in the middle. A system that now treats balance as betrayal. On the surface, everything looks calm. Ships arrive. Statements are issued. Words like peace and stability are carefully chosen. Nothing explodes. No alarms sound. But beneath that calm, the rules are changing. Economic relationships are being rewired into pressure points. Diplomatic language is being replaced by punishment. And choices that used to take decades are being forced in months. You may think this story is happening far away from you. It isn't, because once the space to stay neutral disappears, the cost doesn't stay abstract. It moves into jobs, into prices, into social stability. If you want to understand how that happens and why this moment matters more than it looks, stay with me. Because the system has already begun to close in. For a long time, we told ourselves this world was run by diplomacy, by summits, by carefully balanced statements that left everyone just enough room to breathe. That is no longer what controls the system. What controls it now is leverage, not speeches, not alliances on paper, but the ability to apply pressure quickly, asymmetrically, and without apology. Trade is no longer trade. It's a switch. Aid is no longer assistance. It's a signal. And international law? It isn't a referee. It's a weapon used selectively, ignored conveniently, invoked only when it hurts the other side more than it hurts you. In this system, power doesn't announce itself with tanks first. It arrives as tariffs, as canceled invitations, as reputational damage disguised as moral concern. This is how control works now. Not by conquering territory, but by narrowing options. And when options disappear, countries aren't asked what they want. They're told what they must choose. The most dangerous part is that none of this looks dramatic at first. It looks procedural, technical, manageable, until suddenly it isn't. Because once leverage replaces diplomacy, every neutral space becomes unstable. And every pause becomes suspicious. That's where the real shift began. There was a time when these shifts would have triggered alarms, emergency meetings, public red lines. That didn't happen. Instead, the change arrived slowly, quietly, normalized. Before, power blocks were careful not to blur their roles. Economic groups stayed economic. Security alliances stayed military. Lines were visible. Now those lines are dissolving. Economic forums begin to move hardware. Security language is wrapped in humanitarian terms. Exercises are renamed. Intent is softened. Meaning is obscured. And because nothing explodes, the shift feels manageable. But slow change is the most dangerous kind, because it trains everyone, markets, governments, the public, to accept what would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. What once would have been called escalation is now called cooperation. What once would have demanded explanation now receives a press release. This is how systems drift without resistance. Not through confrontation, but through repetition, each step small enough to defend, each move reasonable on its own, until the accumulation becomes irreversible. By the time the shift is recognized, the structure has already changed, and the cost of reversing it is higher than the cost of silence. That's when the first real shock lands. Not as a surprise, but as a consequence. The shock doesn't arrive with violence. It arrives with coordination. Ships appear where they normally wouldn't. At a port that used to signal alignment without saying it out loud, under a banner that promises calm while delivering something else entirely. Officially, it's about safety. Shipping lanes, joint procedures, routine cooperation, but look closer. The participants matter more than the mission. The timing matters more than the language. And the location matters more than the explanation. Because this isn't about training. It's about visibility. It's about showing that boundaries can be crossed without consequence. That forces once kept separate can now operate side by side, that a space assumed to belong to no one and everyone can be repurposed. The statements are careful. Names are softened. Details are selectively omitted. That silence is not accidental. It's defensive because everyone involved understands the same thing. This moment will be read not by the public, but by the system. And the system doesn't ask questions. It reacts quietly at first, procedurally, then all at once, because once a signal like this is sent, it cannot be unsent. And what follows is never framed as retaliation. It's framed as consequence. Here is where the system reveals how it actually works. Not through outrage, not through speeches, but through conversion. Economic tools are converted into disciplinary tools. Legal language is converted into moral pressure. Reputation is converted into leverage. Nothing is announced as punishment. That's the trick. A tariff isn't called retaliation. It's called adjustment. Aid isn't withdrawn as anger. It's called reassessment. Even isolation is never named. It's framed as consequence for misalignment. This is how the system avoids responsibility while still enforcing order. And the imbalance is structural. Those who control access to markets can afford delay. Those who depend on those markets cannot. Those who can absorb short-term pain can wait. Those whose economies run on employment cannot, so the cost is transferred, not to governments first, but to workers, to exporters, to sectors that don't vote as blocks but suffer as numbers. And once that transfer begins, the choice narrows fast. Because reversing course now isn't free, and continuing forward isn't safe. That's the bind. And it's intentional, because a system that forces you to choose late always chooses for you. This is where the pressure speeds up. Decisions stop waiting for consensus. Markets move before governments speak. Signals land before explanations catch up. A number appears, not a theory, a number. Jobs at risk, not someday, soon. Supply chains tighten, orders pause, factories hesitate, and hesitation is expensive. What looked like foreign policy now feels personal. What sounded abstract now shows up in paychecks. What was framed as strategy starts behaving like a countdown. There is no single announcement, no dramatic declaration, just accumulation. One measure becomes two. One warning becomes policy. One exception disappears. And suddenly, neutrality is no longer a position. It's a liability. At this stage, even walking it back costs more than staying silent. Because the system has already recalculated expectations. The message is clear without being spoken: align or absorb. And once that message is understood, it spreads faster than any press release ever could. Because now, everyone is watching the same thing. What happens next doesn't stay contained. This is the moment where the system stops being theoretical, because this is where it reaches you, not as ideology, not as geopolitics, but as pressure you didn't vote on and can't opt out of. When a market closes, it doesn't close on a government office. It closes on a factory floor, on a farm, on a supply contract that quietly doesn't renew. You're told this is temporary, that it's manageable, that stability will return once clarity does. But clarity in this system means alignment. And alignment has a cost. It means fewer options, less room to argue, less space to disagree without consequence. You can feel it in how fast the conversation shifts, how quickly caution becomes suspicion, how neutrality starts sounding like disloyalty. This is how pressure rewires society from the inside, not through force, but through fear of falling behind. If this feels familiar, that's not an accident. Because once the system learns it can move through economics instead of force, it keeps doing it. If you want to understand where that pressure goes next and why it doesn't stop here, stay with me. Because this isn't just one country's problem anymore. Once this pressure works in one place, it doesn't stay there. It travels. Other governments watch closely. Not the speeches, the results. They watch what happens to trade flows, to credit, to diplomatic standing. They notice which moves trigger silence and which trigger response. And they learn, because this isn't just about one country misreading the moment. It's about a system teaching a lesson in public. The lesson is simple. The cost of standing apart is no longer theoretical. So hesitation spreads, caution multiply, policy hardens. Countries that once balanced begin to pre-align quietly. Votes shift, statements soften. Invitations change, not because beliefs changed, but because risk did. This is how pressure reshapes the map without redrawing borders. How influence expands without occupation. How control scales without consensus. And the most destabilizing part is this. No one is fully in charge of the process anymore. Once the mechanism starts moving, even those who benefit from it lose control over how far it goes. Which is why this moment doesn't settle. It accelerates because the system has discovered something powerful and dangerous, that it can enforce order without ever admitting it is doing so. From here, the system doesn't pause. It branch. There are three paths forward. None of them are clean. The first is adjustment, quiet recalibration. Language softened, signals rebalanced just enough to slow the pressure without provoking it. This path preserves access, but it narrows independence. Every future decision becomes cautious, pre-cleared, predictable. Stability, bought in installments. The second path is erosion, no dramatic break, just gradual loss. Jobs thin out, markets shrink, credibility decays. Nothing collapses at once, but everything costs more politically, economically, socially. This path looks survivable until it isn't, because erosion doesn't announce itself as failure. It feels like adjustment until the buffer is gone. The third path is rupture, open defiance, clear alignment, a line crossed with intention. This path promises clarity, but clarity invites response. Pressure hardens, retaliation escalates, and domestic stability becomes collateral damage. Here's the problem. The system doesn't let you choose freely between these paths. It nudges, constrains, accelerates. By the time the choice feels urgent, it's already been shaped. And that's where the real danger lives. What makes this moment dangerous isn't that anyone is breaking the rules. It's that the rules are dissolving quietly, procedurally, without a vote. In this system, pressure doesn't need permission. It just needs precedent. And precedent has now been set. Once neutrality is treated as defiance, once economics replaces diplomacy, once narratives become enforcement tools, there is no stable middle left to stand on. Not for governments, not for markets, not for societies trying to hold themselves together under invisible strain. You're told this is the cost of a new world. That adaptation is strength. That choosing sides is inevitable. But inevitability is often just pressure that hasn't been named yet, because systems like this don't stop when one country bends. They stop only when they break or when something pushes back hard enough to slow them. And right now, nothing is slowing this one down. If you want to understand where this pressure is headed next, which countries are about to face the same narrowing choices, and what happens when too many systems are forced to decide at once, you'll want to stay close to this story. Because the warning isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It's procedural. And by the time it's obvious, it's already too late to stand in the middle.